Welcome back to Media Science Myth Busting. I'm your host, Philip Lomax, and I'm joined by Dr. Duane Varan. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the power of news and the assumption that news is bad for advertising. So Dr. Varan, why is it often that advertisers don't buy news?
Yeah, that's a great question, Philip. So advertisers often don't buy news because they assume that the negative environment associated with those news stories will transfer to the ad, that it will cast its stain, cast its negative mood kind of like to the ad, and that the ad will be seen in a poorer light. So the effects for the ad would be significantly worse in the news environment. That's the assumption, at least.
So is there truth to this convention?
Absolutely not. We have tested this question many times over the past decade. We've done this in independent work that we've done with academics. We've done it in studies that we've done ourselves. We've done it in work that we've done for clients, and our clients include most of the major TV news networks. And across every study that we've done, we have consistently seen that there is no evidence for this assumption. There is no negative effect associated with news. In fact, if anything, we find that there's often a superior effect, particularly often for memory structures.
Wow. It's often a superior impact.
It's amazing. It's incredible. Yes, the assumption is fundamentally flawed.
Interesting. But there are different types of news. What about the difference between negative versus positive news, Dr. Brand?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's a question that we tested specifically in a study that we did for CNN. And in that study, we tested either positive or negative news stories, and we found that the ad impact was significantly higher in the negative news stories than it was in the positive news stories.
Significantly higher in the negative news stories as compared to the positive news stories.
And we think that what is happening here is that there's an effect that we call mood repair that's at work here. In fact, this is something we looked at specifically in this CNN study that we did, where we had very deep measures, including EEG, and we were looking at what is called an approach or a withdrawal mechanism. So are you drawn to the content, or are you kind of like aversive and defensive? So people have different motivations for watching content. Oftentimes that motivation could be that they want to be kind of like in a sad mood, or they want to watch horror or something like that, but that's not why they're watching news. When they're watching news, they still want to leave the news in a good mood. And so they use the ads to help restore that sense of balance. And so to test this, we use this EEG measure, again, approach withdrawal, for the ads seen after negative or positive news stories. And what we discovered was that the approach activation was significantly higher following negative content. So that tells us that they were using the ads to restore, if you will, that more positive attitude, which helps explain why those results were superior.
That's incredible that we can use advertising to bring us back to a form of equilibrium. But Dr. Varan, what about digital? Is the same hold true for digital environments?
Absolutely. That was the focus of a study that we did for the Premium Content Alliance in Australia. The Premium Content Alliance is an alliance of most of the major Australian publishers, which includes all the key news publishers in Australia.
And for the benefit of our audience, this study that Media Science conducted with the Premium Content Alliance was one of the largest studies in the world testing the subject of the power of news and its impact on advertising.
And what we discovered in that study was that memory performance was significantly higher across all three stages of memory when people were exposed to news content versus non-news. So across the memory encoding phase, the memory storage phase, and the memory retrieval phase. And in fact, for memory retrieval, what we found was that it was delivering 120% of the effect. In other words, ads and news were 2.2 times more effective in terms of memory than non-news.
Dr. Varan, that example is incredible. Can you share a little bit more about the methods that Media Science has used to measure this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've used a lot of different methods. You know, we first stumbled into these insights in 2013. It was an academic study that we were doing, which was looking at the differences associated with funny ads being in either funny content or non-funny content. And the non-funny was informational, which included news-style stories. And what we discovered in that was that ads were just as effective. And that was a real surprise for us. So that led us to really theorizing about, well, why were those results the case? Then we had an opportunity with a study that came along for NBC. We shared with them those results, and they were like, oh, that's really interesting. We'd love to see more, particularly getting at the why those results were the way they were. So we designed this experiment. It was called the Why News Study. It got a lot of market attention at the time. And what we did was people watched either news content or they watched primetime entertainment content. And the primetime was the leading comedy at the time, the leading drama at the time, and the leading reality show at the time. And so instead of an ad break, when people went from the program to what would have been the ad break, they actually played a little psychological game. So for example, one of these was the Stroop task, which is you see a color written out, spelt out. Let's say it's B-L-U-E. So you see B-L-U-E, and then it appears in a different color, so it appears in red. So your gut says, that's red. But you have to fight your gut and say, no, that's not red, that's blue. And so that was the test. And what we did was we looked at the speed with which you could correctly identify the right color. And what we discovered was that people could correctly identify the right color faster after exposure to news than primetime content.
That just makes so much sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, because you have activation of your cognitive resources, and that primes you basically, and you go into the ad break with better access to your memory structures, which now explains why we're seeing these superior effects that we talked about for news. And we've done other methods as well. So for example, we had another study where the respondents, we pre-screened them so that they did not speak Chinese or couldn't read Chinese. And then they were exposed to a Chinese character after having seen either news or primetime content. And they had to identify whether they thought this was for a positive or negative construct. And if you think about it, if this assumption is right, that news has this negative transfer, then what you would expect to see is that people would more often perceive this character to be negative.
Indeed.
But actually that was not the case. And in fact, people were equally likely to pick it being positive or negative. So we saw no evidence of this kind of negative transfer effect. So across all of these studies that we've done for over a decade, and there were many of these studies using different methods, we consistently have found no evidence for this kind of negative news effect. So you have to say the convention is busted.
So there you have it. The myth of news is bad for advertising is officially busted. Join us again for our next episode. And until then, thank you very much to our audience.